All right, so we're going to get started, and somebody has background noise, so thanks for muting. So, Pedro, are you there? I just want to make sure we're all set.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes, sounds great. Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We're really excited to have everybody on today. This is Megan at Rise Together Bay Area. And we are really excited to be co-hosting this webinar, first in a series on local affordable housing policies and tools that we can use to increase access to affordable housing. And this is one of Rise Together's core goals. As a coalition of the 9-county Bay Area with over 250 organizations as members across the Bay, we have heard time and again that this is the core issue that we need to be focusing on. So in addition to a strong start around early childhood education and then quality employment for all workers, we're really focused on the affordable housing crisis and the movement. And so we're really pleased to be hosting this webinar series with Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, and a special thank you to NPH and Pedro for your partnership on this and helping to help us understand how to best plug our partners into advocacy opportunities where it can really leverage change and make a difference. And these local tools are a really great example of that. So I'm going to, without too much further ado, introduce Pedro as the first speaker. So Pedro leads the Nonprofit Housing Association's regional work, building coalitions across the Bay Area and conducting innovative policy research to make the Bay Area a more affordable place to live. And he successfully championed the incorporation of an affordable housing-focused action plan for the region's 40-year strategic Plan Bay Area, and authored On Track Together, NPH's plan for linking transportation and affordable housing investments. And Pedro comes with a wealth of experience in the field. He's worked with the Association of Bay Area Governments on Plan Bay Area and worked as a policy advisor for 2 San Francisco supervisors. And so we're just really lucky to have Pedro on board with us to help move this in the right direction. And we'll also be hearing from Michael Lane today at NPH. He has an extensive background in public policy as well, and legislation and campaigns. So prior to joining NPH in 2011, he worked for a decade with self-help enterprises managing pre-development activities, government and media relations around local, state, and federal housing policy and legislation, and has a wealth of experience himself. So we'll hear more from Michael soon. So I just want to thank again our partners at NPH, and Pedro, let's get started.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much also for the opportunity to partner with Rise Together to share some of these new tools that we now have at our disposal to directly deal with the affordable housing crisis that we are all facing. So I assume you're all here because you recognize that there's an affordable housing crisis and that it is a major issue in the Bay Area. So I'm not going to be spending any time really describing that. But we're going to get started right away with talking about some of the tools that local governments now have at their disposal to directly deal with the crisis. So this is just to put a picture to the names. We're real people. And Megan's already did a fabulous job introducing us. To tell you all a little bit more about NPH, we are a nearly 40-year-old affordable housing advocacy organization at the local, regional, and state levels. We believe in a Bay Area where low-income communities and communities of color have the opportunity to stay and prosper, and where everyone has an affordable place to call home. Some of our work in the past has involved, in 2016, we helped pass 3 Bay Area affordable housing ballot measures in Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, and Alameda County that together will bring in over $2 billion for affordable housing development. Last year in the legislative session, we had a landmark year where we helped pass 15 housing bills and get them signed by the governor, two of which we'll be talking to you about today. And at the regional level, we are really focused on using all the tools at our disposal to get local governments to comply with state housing law and to be doing everything that they can proactively to address our region's housing crisis. Because it doesn't just hurt low income families, it hurts everyone. It hurts our commute, it hurts our quality of life, it hurts our air. The very air that we breathe is impacted by this. And so, as NPH, we firmly believe that every government, every city, every county should be doing everything that they can to address the housing crisis. And so, as I mentioned today, and I'm going to see if I can lower this. Yes, okay, that's better. Um, so as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about two new tools that local governments have at their disposal to tackle the housing crisis. Both are bills that passed in last year's legislative session. One is called AB 1505, which now gives power to cities and counties to require, if they so choose, that new rental developments include affordable units. And AB 1598, which gives cities and counties the power to use the growth in their existing property taxes to raise additional funding for affordable housing. What's really nice about both of these tools is that they do not represent any new taxes. They don't need to go to the ballot, and local governments can act upon them immediately to make a difference to raise significant resources to deal with to provide housing affordable to our working families. And so I'm going to go a little more into a little more detail around AB 1505. So AB 1505 is focused on inclusionary housing, and I have these pictures of buildings, beautiful market rate condos here. And the reason that they're here is because inclusionary housing is, for those of you who don't know the term, it's when a jurisdiction requires that a certain percentage of homes in new housing developments, whether they are new for rent developments or new for sale developments, be offered at below market rate, whether those are below market rate rents or sales prices. Um, if if a developer can't offer those units at those prices in the building itself, they are required alternately to do something else to address the housing crisis, whether it's paying fees to build affordable housing elsewhere, dedicating land somewhere so that affordable housing can be built, or building the affordable units somewhere else, but to the same degree that you would build it if it were included in the building. So to illustrate this, I have a real life example of how this is currently working in the Bay Area. So there is a very large development in San Francisco at 1629 Market Street. It has 528 market rate units, and out of those 528, it includes 158 affordable rental units, or 30% of those units are going to be affordable to low and very low income households. Um, and what's really great about inclusionary housing is that you use the power of the market to create opportunities for lower income households who otherwise would not be able to afford to live in these communities. And so it's called inclusionary because you are including low income people with the growth of your city or your county. And inclusionary housing is a very popular policy in the Bay Area, largely due to the work of advocacy organizations, NPH included, that really pushed for local government to adopt this tool and use it to help guide growth. And so what this map shows is all the areas in blue are all the cities in the Bay Area that have some kind of inclusionary housing ordinance in place. Out of the region's 101 cities, 73 of them have some sort of inclusionary, which is a huge accomplishment. And so it's a tool that is widely recognized to yield a lot of benefit and to promote equitable development in the region. Which brings us to 1505 and why it was necessary. And so I'm actually going to go back to this map. So as you can see, the Bay Area um, has for a long time recognized the value of inclusionary housing, and it's a very widespread policy. But in 2009, there was a California Court of Appeals decision that prevented local government from requiring new affordable rentals, new market rate rental development, without the local government giving some sort of additional assistance. And the major issue with that is inclusionary housing is generally used to have market rate developers help provide for those units, and requiring local governments to provide additional assistance didn't mean that local governments suddenly had a lot of money to give to affordable housing. So the result was cities and counties throughout the Bay Area had to change the way that they applied their inclusionary housing ordinance. They did that either by adopting impact fees, and those are fees on new development um, to pay for affordable housing elsewhere, or they stopped requiring new affordable rentals. So they would require for new for sale housing developments to have a certain number of affordable units, but they could not require that new affordable rentals also have affordable.
Pedro, let me just pause you. If, we're hearing a lot of background noise. If everyone could make sure that they are on mute. And I think, Pedro, as host, you can also mute everybody.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't on mute.
All right, everybody, please mute yourselves. Thank you so much,
right,
so that we can hear.
Mute everybody. Please don't take this the wrong way.
Thank you, Pedro.
Okay. And so, as I was saying, there was this 2009 ruling. It prevented local governments from requiring new affordable rentals. And so cities and counties adapted by either adopting new impact fees or by just requiring new affordable ownership units, but they couldn't do it for rental units. And so what AB 1505 does, it's also known as the Palmer fix because it fixes that ruling. That ruling had a chilling effect throughout California, and it was widely derided because in San Jose alone, for instance, that city missed the opportunity to get over 2,000 new affordable units because of this ruling. And so now, because of this bill, cities and counties can now require, if they so choose, to that new rental developments include affordable units. And what's really nice about it too is that if your city or county already had something on the books that required affordable rentals, an inclusionary ordinance that required affordable rentals that was adopted before this decision, those ordinances can now go back into effect. Which is great because you don't have to pass something new to start getting those inclusionary rental units. What this means also is if your city or county is adopting a new ordinance, so after 2017, or if your city has or city or county has repealed the old ordinance in order to be compliant with this court ruling, just 1 second, I'm just having one quick technical issue. Okay. Just unmuting Megan so she can also help with this. um, and so what happened, so with this, with AB 1505, um, if you are adopting a new inclusionary ordinance, or if your jurisdiction had to repeal its old inclusionary ordinance and now will have to readopt it, what that means is cities and counties can require that up to 15% of new rental units be affordable to households making under percent of area median income. Um, there is no need for a nexus study, and if you're not familiar with that term, it means that your city does not need to undertake a study of market strength and how your inclusionary requirements will impact overall development in your city. That's not required. That is something that is required if you're adopting a fee. So that removes an important hurdle. All that your city or county needs to do is adopt an ordinance to implement this inclusionary requirement. What 1505 also did, it did establish a new level of review if your city or county chooses to go over the 15% number. And so say you want to require 20 or 25% inclusionary in your city, um, then what it could do is it could potentially trigger a review by the state through the Department of Housing and Community Development if your city also meets one of the following conditions. So if your city hasn't permitted at least 75% of the market rate housing that it was supposed to plan for over the past 5 years, then HCD could review the ordinance to make sure that it's not going to have a chilling effect on new market rate development. Or if your city or county hasn't submitted a report to the state that that details how you're complying with state housing law for the past 2 years, then that review is also triggered. But even with these restrictions, this tool is already getting some new traction. And so just this year, we've had at least two and more on the way inclusionary ordinances being adopted. Redwood City just adopted theirs, and it has a 20% affordability requirement for new rental development. So as you can see, that's higher than the 15% trigger in the state law that would trigger a review. Redwood City, however, does not need to worry about HCD or the state reviewing their inclusionary ordinance because they actually permitted over 316% of their market rate housing. So they're well above the 75% market rate housing that they needed to have permitted in order to avoid HCD review. And El Cerrito recently adopted an inclusionary requirement that's well within the state guidelines, which they now require 10% affordability for new rental development. And because that's well below, they also did not trigger the HCD review. And so as you think about this tool, and you saw from my previous map that it's something that's very widespread already in the Bay Area, you might want to think about a few questions. Does your city or county already have an inclusionary ordinance? It could be that you already have something in the books, but you're just enforcing it for new for sale developments. And you might just need to amend it to require new rental development. Um, does your city, and as I said, does your city already have something in the books or that requires new ownership units, but not new rentals? So you might just want to amend that. If your city doesn't have an inclusionary ordinance at all, then you might want to consider adopting something new. And another very important question to ask is, does your city already have impact fees? That is, does your city already charge a per square foot fee on new development to pay for affordable housing elsewhere? Because that would also have implications on whether or not your city would want to do an inclusionary ordinance. And sometimes those were put in place of having an inclusionary ordinance. So these are all very important considerations to have. Um, and so I just gave you all a lot of questions and we left a lot of information and we left ample time in this webinar for questions. And so I think Megan is going to read some that may have come in while I was presenting.
Thanks so much, Pedro. Yeah, so we'd love for everyone to be able to type questions into the Zoom group chat box, if you see that. So please go ahead and type any questions that you have for Pedro in that box. So we've got one question just to be able to see the map again.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And perhaps speak a little bit more to that.
Sure. So
great.
this map was put together by the Association of Bay Area Governments. If you don't know who they are, the Association of Bay Area Governments are they are a regional planning organization. All local governments in the Bay Area are members, and they have a wealth of information of housing policies that are on the ground right now in every city and county in the region. And 2 years ago, they did a survey of all the jurisdictions in the region to see whether they had certain housing policies in place. And um, and so cities said yes or no, they have something like inclusionary in place. And so this is the result of that survey. And actually at the end of this, after I'm done answering questions, I do have a slide that has additional resources. And that's one of the websites that I list there because it's not just for inclusionary, there are many other policies that are being tracked. And you can also see which cities have it in a map. And it also includes examples of good versions of inclusionary policies and other policies as well that your cities might consider.
Great, thank you. Another question came in around just clarifying that cities are allowed to do this, but not required. So what do you think are the best steps for putting external pressure on cities to pass these ordinances?
That's a very good point and a key one. I think the first and foremost is just raising awareness of the tool. What's really nice is compared to a lot of other affordable housing, a lot of other tools to raise resources for affordable housing, inclusionary has some of the lowest barriers. All it takes is a city council ordinance to put this in place. And it uses what's already happening in the city development to make sure that that growth can also provide for the needs of lower income households. And so I would say the first thing is if you have any opportunity to meet your local city council person, to bring this up if your city doesn't have it and ask them why it doesn't. I mean, there's still, while most cities in the Bay Area have inclusionary housing, there's still some gray spots on that map that are pretty significant. And so that's a worthwhile question. A lot of people, they're not familiar with it because when you say inclusionary housing, it's something that's a technical term. But if you frame it in a way of, hey, why is it that when these luxury condos are going up, we're not requiring that any of those apartments actually be affordable to the people living here? That will raise some eyebrows and will likely help start a series of conversations. There are local housing advocacy groups that cover most Bay Area counties that I'd be happy to connect you with, that you can also contact for help in how you can ask for your city or county to adopt an inclusionary requirement.
Great, thank you. So now the questions are coming in. Let's see. So you mentioned, Pedro, affordable housing impact fees. Are you suggesting to have those in place on top of the inclusionary requirement or to be in place in case units can't be built?
In many places in the Bay Area, there's both. there are both impact fees as well as inclusionary requirements. Now, um, that's a calculation that needs to be made at the local level for what makes sense because the housing market looks very different depending on where you are in the Bay Area. And as I mentioned before, impact fees do require what are called nexus studies or a study that looks at the strength of the market to support those impact fees. And so in an ideal world, you would have some fees. You could actually have a pretty strong inclusionary ordinance that's coupled with maybe a fee, not necessarily on housing development. You could do a fee on new commercial development to pay for affordable housing. And so you're getting at it from both sides. Um, Inclusionary ordinances generally do offer developers an opportunity to pay a fee. Um, to potentially build it, to potentially build the housing elsewhere. And so that's already generally a component of these ordinances, but you can have it in combination. And my colleague Michael wanted to jump in too on this question.
Yeah, this is Michael. Thank you all for joining us. I just wanted to clarify on that AB 15051 one difference is it does require that you provide alternative means of compliance, which previously was not required, which means that, as Pedro said, you do need to offer other ways of meeting this inclusionary requirement, which could be in lieu fees. It could be a land dedication, that you have land somewhere else to help to develop the affordable housing, those kinds of things. So I think it's a best practice. We had defaulted to the impact fees as a result of the Palmer decision, but we don't want to pile on fees and affordable requirements, I think, in a way that could stifle development altogether, and then you get no affordable units. So it's generally, I think, mostly you would choose one or the other, but as Pedro indicated, where you do have a lot of commercial development and office coming online, oftentimes you can look at a commercial linkage fee for that kind of commercial development that also is helping to address the jobs housing gap, which is so tremendous in the Bay Area. And so you do have to have that alternative compliance, but I would also say that oftentimes housing impact fees, that kind of a regime also allowed you, just as the opposite of that, to provide the units on site. So to the extent that you're providing alternatives and options, we think that's the way to go, where you could have a mixed income development, which is oftentimes very positive, but oftentimes if you have luxury condos or something, it may be more valuable to take some of those fees and then invest those in 100% development, where we can leverage those funds with other affordable housing funds to get 100% affordable development in the community, which also has on-site resident services that can also strengthen the local community as well.
Great. Thank you. So a number of questions related to that. So one is, though inclusionary housing is a best practice, how do we control the upward pressure on rents from the market rate units? For example, no one can keep up with affordable housing, and market rate unit development will outpace affordable units.
I think that that's the overall problem with the overheated housing market that we're in, and also with just the sheer number of jobs that the Bay Area is adding without adding housing, whether affordable or otherwise. And then there's an article that best captures this, but it called "Why We Must Build" that I keep coming back to, because essentially, while at a neighborhood level, building new market rate units might increase some of the price pressures in that particular neighborhood. Regionally, in the whole Bay Area, it helps bring prices down overall, and which is why we need to be building housing really everywhere in the Bay Area. There are plenty of higher income neighborhoods where the households living there are already at those higher income levels. So where you would see, if there are price pressures, you would see those be significantly less than, say, in lower income, more vulnerable neighborhoods. So where you build also does matter, but but everyone needs to be doing their part, and it doesn't need to look the same everywhere. And so with that said, what's interesting is that if looking at the data for just new development, new market rate developments, they are actually not being able to charge as much as they were just a few years ago. You're seeing deals where they're offering a free month's rent or 6 weeks or even 2 months of rent for living there. And that's because you are seeing more housing overall being built, which generally helps. But I think every community needs to have a thoughtful discussion around where housing growth should go. And in places where communities have decided it should go, then making sure that it happens and it happens in a way that serves people of all income levels.
Thanks, Pedro. And does AB 1505 allow for this in county jurisdictions or just at the city level?
Both cities and counties. So unincorporated counties can do this as well, and that that varies a lot. The size of the unincorporated county varies a lot depending on where you are in the Bay Area. But for instance, unincorporated Sonoma County could do this. Unincorporated Contra Costa County could do this. And in those places, you would actually see a lot of development being captured by that.
Great. And someone shared that Hayward recently passed an ordinance to increase the in lieu fees, but the council refused to codify a inclusionary requirement. Have you seen that issue before where they get kind of split?
Some jurisdictions just have fees, that's right.
And some might choose to just pursue this with fees, and some have a hybrid approach. So for the longest time, the city of Berkeley, for instance, had both a fee and an inclusionary requirement, and the fee was set in such a way that developers generally opted to build the inclusionary units instead of paying the fees, whereas other places, like the city of Oakland, they only have fees and they don't have an inclusionary requirement.
Another factor is that there's a state density bonus law which would allow a market rate developer to get additional density for providing the affordable units to try to help make them pencil. And we also have a court case that affirms that units provided through an inclusionary policy as a requirement at the local level also allow a developer to access that density bonus.
Great, thanks. And then could you just go over the affordability levels again? I think you mentioned this, but are there requirements on the percentages within the affordability levels? So 20% moderate, for example, 50%, 15% low, or is that up to the cities to decide?
It's generally up to the cities to decide. The only requirement at the state level is that if your city or county is going to require that 15% of the units be affordable to low and very low income households. So those are households making less than 80% of area median income. If you want to require anything over that 15% that be affordable to low or very low, that could trigger a review by the Department of Housing and Community Development. But with that said, you could have a 15% requirement for low and very low, but you could have an additional 5% affordable to moderate income, which are 80 to 120%. But this is the only restriction based on state law. Otherwise, it's fully up to the jurisdiction to decide what the mix is. And
in some jurisdictions, for example, it's just say 10 or 15% at 80% of AMI and below. Others are more prescriptive and actually break it out between low and very low or different income categories. But it really does allow a maximum amount of local control and for jurisdictions to design the program that works best for them at the local level and what they have the political will and support to do. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, the League of California Cities was a strong supporter of AB 1505 because it doesn't require jurisdictions to do anything, and for the most part allows them to tailor a policy and an ordinance at the local level that they're comfortable with.
Excellent, thanks. And I imagine that's why we need community partners and others to collaborate with their local jurisdictions to really set those standards.
That's right.
So another
Whatever the submarket may, whatever the submarket may be, and what we've seen, the way we've seen this work is that oftentimes advocates will engage with a city council member who may be a friendly and wants to address these issues, and/or staff members. But just even pointing out that the bill was passed last year, and that it's time for action, that can also be helpful just to raise attention and review what the existing ordinance, if there is one on the book, says, and if it's actually being enforced at the local level.
Great. So another question here around, can cities pressure a developer to do inclusionary so the units are guaranteed to be built, or the developer now, does the developer now have the right to choose the alternative?
So the developer, the city can pressure the developer, and it's all part of the negotiations that go into each individual development deal. So it really depends on the local context. Developers, through this law, always do have the option to try to provide an equivalent of providing the units through some other way, whether it's dedicating land, paying fees to build the units elsewhere. However, the city can structure their inclusionary ordinance like Berkeley did, to try to get the units on site, but it's really up to every city and up to the deal that's involved. And cities have many levers to try to do that.
The other issue I would just raise is it depends on what the zoning is on the site. So, for example, if you have a properly zoned site and the builder's just going in to basically pull a permit and build, basically on, we call it an entitlement because it conforms to what that site is zoned for, and you don't have inclusionary in the books, then there's really not a way to, if it's just a ministerial approval, in essence, there's not a way to do that. Sometimes, as you know, through CEQA challenges and the threat of litigation, there is a negotiation opportunity. But in general, this bill does not prohibit what we call developer agreements when the developer is asking for a change of zoning or some kinds of other concessions or variances based on what's allowed on a particular site. And that opens the door for an opportunity to negotiate what we call community benefits even more broadly, which could include an affordability component, which could even be higher than the 15 or 20%, depending on, as Pedro says, what the local context is. And so you will still see many developer agreements where, in essence, the developer is voluntarily providing, say, 25% affordability. Maybe it's a larger planned kind of a specific plan development of some kind, where that is required for that particular area, and then the developer is delivering those units on site through that process.
Great. I'll just ask everyone if we'll take one more question, and then if anyone has any additional questions on this topic, please get them in now. So one more question came in around protecting rent increases based on tenant income. There's been the county state AMI at lease renewal. There's issues where tenants live in affordable units. However, the rents have increased based on AMI, not tenant income. Any thoughts on that related to this ordinance?
Yeah, so here again, the local jurisdiction, what we should be advocating for is for these units to remain affordable over the long term. And they're typically targeted at, as you said, at the income levels, and you want to try to match those depending on how variegated the ordinance is. So you would like to see a 55-year regulatory agreement that would lock in that affordability long term and not just for some shorter period of time, if possible. But you're right, they typically are pegged to incomes, and so the rents can increase, but obviously not to the extent of a market rate development. And there is no, as we currently have with Costa-Hawkins, there's no vacancy decontrol. So if someone moves out of a unit, it still maintains the affordability for the new resident as long as they qualify at that income level. And there again, some jurisdictions are more prescriptive than others, but in general, inclusionary is seen in some cases even as a way to get to the missing middle, and some of the more highly income targeted, as it were, types of deed restricted units. And that's why you'll see many ordinances that do have 80% of AMI and some even higher than that, because they're trying to get a significant number of units without, as Pedro has said, stifling new development, and they really see the more deeply income targeted units where you really want, and where you have special needs and ELI and that kind of thing, and a large degree of VLI, very low income and extremely low income, as 100% affordable developments where you can provide those types of resident services. And that's where this trade-off, if you get the in lieu fee, and then you combine that with other sources at the state and federal level, you can deliver even more deeply income targeted units. And that's really the way to deliver those units. Whereas the inclusionary piece and the kind of the mixed income policies tend to be folks with a little higher incomes who are also still struggling in this rental market.
And just to add a little bit to what Michael said regarding the in lieu fees, the way that affordable housing developers can take advantage of inclusionary ordinances is sometimes if a developer opts to pay for a fee, then that fee can then be taken by the affordable housing developer, match it with state and federal dollars to build a 100% affordable building, which will be heavily regulated and will stay affordable for at least 55 years. And affordable housing developers, while sometimes they can raise the rents according to AMI, NPH, we have a membership of many affordable housing developers. They're very mindful of those and do so only when they must, and really look at it as a tool of last resort. We're truly trying to build homes that can remain affordable for our lowest income residents for the longest period of time possible.
I think one other scenario I just would point out before we move on would be, you do have situations where you may have a large master plan kind of a development, and there's an affordability requirement, and this is where the land dedication might come in, where a market rate developer will come in, and then to get to the inclusionary, they'll make that land, part of that land, available for 100% affordable development, and they'll partner with a nonprofit affordable housing developer to come in. But because they're able to write down the cost of that land and then also provide some gap financing within the project to help subsidize that affordable development, then the affordable developer will take that land and that gap funding and then go to the state for their loan programs and federal tax credits, and put together the financing, the capital stack, as we call it, to be able to make that project go forward. And so within the larger development, which could be market rate, you'd also have a significant number of buildings that would be 100% affordable and very deeply income targeted.
Great. There's a couple of other questions that came out on this, so let's just spend a couple more minutes. If you could briefly speak to what Berkeley did to guarantee the units were built with the project.
So one thing that I want to note is that the whole guarantee of construction is a little bit more, it's a little bit difficult than when you're thinking about market rate units, because oftentimes developers, market rate developers, they line up a site, they have the building be approved, but sometimes their funding goes through, and if it falls through, then no units are built, period. And so I'm just cautioning with that. But with the way that, now speaking specifically to the Berkeley example, they had a $30,000, developers had an option to either build the unit or pay a $30,000 fee per unit to not have to build the unit on site. Many developers considered that amount of money high enough that they opted to build the unit on site, and they would then couple it with additional state incentives. So Michael mentioned earlier the state density bonus law. And what that is specifically is it allows developers to build taller or denser buildings with more units in them than they would otherwise be able to due to local zoning. And so developers would then opt to build more affordable units instead of paying the fee, but in exchange, they would be able to build more market rate to pay for those units on site.
And density bonus also allows for other concessions like reduced parking requirements and setbacks and those kinds of things to make sure that if they're required for the feasibility of the development to go forward, that those are concessions local governments must make in exchange for the affordable units. The other example I would just use would be the city of San Mateo, which actually, prior to the Palmer decision, did require on-site inclusionary housing and didn't allow for any other alternative means of compliance, fees or land dedication or anything else. But they will have to amend their ordinance. They're going through that process right now as a result of AB 1505, which does require that alternative means of compliance are provided.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was a really rich discussion on 1505, and I think really informative. I know we learned a lot. So let's move on to AB 1598, and I think, Michael, you're going to lead this discussion for us.
Great. And real quick, just before we jump there, I just wanted to point out a couple more resources that exist if you're thinking about inclusionary housing ordinance. NPH developed an inclusionary housing advocacy toolkit that has best practices on how to craft a policy that works for your community. We have a link to ABAG's website that produced that map that has information on inclusionary ordinances as well as other policies. And Grounded Solutions Network also has a website that has extensive resources on how you can make these policies work for your community. So I'm just flagging this for you, as this presentation will live online, so you can access them later. So with that, Michael, please.
So I just want to mention, to everyone just that we will have this presentation recorded and the links that Pedro just provided and this entire PowerPoint presentation on our website by next week. So we will send everyone a link to that. All right, thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you. And so I think you're getting a flavor of the kind of the work that we do in Sacramento is really geared toward getting tools approved at the state level that can be used by advocates at the local level and jurisdictions to really help meet the affordable housing crisis and the needs on the ground, and to facilitate that work to the extent that we can. And obviously the Palmer fix for AB 1505 is an example of this. But I want to talk about another opportunity here, which are called affordable housing authorities, and that was AB 1598 that was signed into law last year by Governor Brown, and actually wasn't even part of the 15 bill package, but was over and above that, and wanted to draw attention to this for a few reasons. First of all, we want to distinguish this from what we call public housing authorities. Those, as you know, are quasi-governmental and oftentimes have boards that are appointed by counties, et cetera. This is actually a tax increment financing tool that we also are using a similar name for, but would really be a financing tool that cities and counties could use. So just wanted to kind of make that distinction. And in general, I want to say the way that we got to this is, as Pedro had mentioned in the introduction, is that NPH has worked on several county-wide measures to fund affordable housing, and typically those have been general obligation bonds, like the one that was passed in San Francisco, Alameda County, and Santa Clara County, over $2 billion in affordable housing funding approved by voters. And then we also had a sales tax extension in San Mateo County. But we also realized that many jurisdictions may not have the political will or the support of voters necessarily to go to the ballot. And so are there approaches that could be a non-electoral strategy that could generate revenues for affordable housing, particularly without raising taxes or having to go to the ballot to get approval, because we know that can be very challenging politically, and it can be expensive to run a campaign, certainly, and to be able to bring that to voters, particularly when there's a 2/3 voter approval requirement, as there is for a GO bond. And so we wanted to come up with tools that could also be used for other parts of our Bay Area that may not be able to do that. And so that's really, I just wanted to give that background as the genesis for AB 1598. Okay, page down. Yeah. When I get there. Okay. So when we talk about tax increment financing, many of you may recall that was a tool that was really about redevelopment, and this is different than redevelopment in many ways, but that tax increment financing concept that was at the heart of redevelopment is also what we're using for affordable housing authorities, with some significant distinctions, and kind of want to talk about some of those. Under the old redevelopment, there was a 20% set aside for affordable housing, but you could use 80% of the tax increment financing for. Can you go back up? You could use 80% for commercial development and to help subsidize that. And as you know, there was lots of controversy around that and abuses, et cetera, for how some of those funds were used, which actually led in part to the elimination of redevelopment. But what our affordable housing authorities do is only focus on the development of affordable housing up to 120% AMI, and requires that all the other income levels are targeted as they are in RENA, where it's broken out, for low, moderate, and above moderate. And so we would, and very low, and we would continue to do that, and actually ask that if this tool is used, that we fund those units at a minimum based on the RENA allocation that a jurisdiction receives. So another difference with this TIF tool compared to redevelopment is that there's no requirement of a blight finding, and it's not limited to a particular geographic area in the jurisdiction, although it can be, and we'll talk about that. But what we were seeing is in many parts of the areas, there were jurisdictions that continued to approve new commercial and office development, but still weren't developing housing, and there weren't a lot of funding opportunities available in some cases to fund affordable housing, and so the jobs housing gap just continued to grow apace. And so what we thought is there a way to capture the increase in assessed value, that increment of property tax, as these new large, it could be a tech campus that's expanding, it could be an Apple headquarters, those kinds of things. And is there a way, as that assessed value increases, to capture at least a portion of that and dedicate those resources to affordable housing without raising taxes? And remember, these are property taxes that, but for this new development, would not be available. So it's really the improvements to the real property that makes that assessed value increase. And we saw jurisdictions assessed values increasing 10, 12, 15% year over year due to this new office and commercial development. And so that was one thing that we were looking at. The other thing I would point out is that our bill, unlike redevelopment, also allows for sales tax increment to be another one of those sources if you're using the kind of the Bradley Burns, the local sales tax that would belong to the city or county. For those, it does have to be the entire jurisdiction, whether that's a city or a county, just because that's the way sales taxes are collected. But there again, it doesn't have to be the full increase. It could be some portion of that increase, which is also somewhat different than redevelopment, because we know there are also other demands in terms of essential services and police and fire and pension obligations that the local jurisdictions are needing to address as well. So the general concept is, and this was also true for redevelopment, but just the way the tax increment financing generally works, is that you're freezing, as Pedro has, they're freezing or capping the property tax at that particular level, which is your base year. And then from there, increases in that increment, that growth of the property and or sales taxes could be diverted and dedicated to help finance affordable housing. It depends on what the base year allows. Now, our AB 1598 actually allows that base year to be a previous year, and people might ask, well, how does that work? Well, if you did have some significant commercial development that came on in the past and did generate, in some cases, it generated some additional reserves for the city, it could function as a loan where to get this new affordable housing authority up and get it started and to issue bonds if you choose to do that as well over time, you could make a loan to this new affordable housing authority and then get repaid over time, but that could be a temporary loan from a reserve that a city may have accumulated due to a significant increase in assessed value at a particular time due to new development coming online. And then the second bullet that you'll see, we call out the idea that the sales tax increment can also be used as long as it's not a special sales tax override for a particular purpose that's not related to housing. So for example, you wouldn't tap into sales taxes that were dedicated to transportation, for example, but only those sales taxes which are general use to the local government, and you can kind of calculate what that increment would be over time. And if you want, this bill allows you to then issue debt for up to 45 years which just means you can pay that off over time with this increment as it grows, but it can allow you to jumpstart and front load projects by getting a significant amount of money up front, and then doing the debt service over time through these revenue sources. So we wanted to create a tool that was as flexible as possible, that would encourage local jurisdictions to do this. You know, typically the local jurisdiction's share of property taxes is about 15 cents on the dollar. It varies, of course, jurisdiction by jurisdiction as a result of Proposition 13. But typically a county will receive 25 to 30 cents on the dollar. So there's also the opportunity for the county to get into an agreement with one city or multiple cities through a JPA sort of a function or an MOU, where they could go in and create this funding source and actually generate more revenues. And as I said, they don't have to siphon off all of the growth in property and or sales taxes, but they could agree upon a percentage that they would dedicate to. Could be a housing trust fund. There could be a lead agency like the county housing department, where you could then have cities and the county agree to set aside a certain portion of that growth and then fund a series of activities. And so we wanted to make this as user-friendly as possible and to maximize the flexibility at the local level. And one of the ways that would work is you could designate just one geographic area in a particular city or county and take all of the tax increment, the increase, in just that area, or you could designate the entire jurisdiction as the housing authority and just take a percentage of a larger amount of the increase because you're covering the entire jurisdiction. But we leave that decision up to the jurisdictions involved. But we do have a large list here that you'll see of various kinds of activities, and these are the kinds of activities that are required, as you'll see there, to really make affordable housing possible with partnership with the local jurisdiction and nonprofit affordable housing developers. And so those are the kinds of activities that are authorized under AB 1598. And the beauty of this, I'll just highlight the last point because I think I've touched mostly on the other two bullet points, is that this can be adopted with local resolution with an MOU if you want to do multiple jurisdictions, or only one could do that as well. And it doesn't solve the entire crisis, but it does provide that first money in oftentimes for a development to really line it up and to be competitive for other sources. You could acquire land, you could provide some of that initial pre-development financing, construction loans that can be repaid. It just allows the local jurisdiction to do lots of different things, gap financing which can then be coupled with other sources, including state sources and federal tax credits, to get a development done. And there's no voter approval required, and your local elected officials on the city council or board of supervisors provide the oversight, and they are the oversight board. We also have at least one public member who would participate on that oversight board to make sure that the funds are being utilized correctly. And this is an important point here, why another way is different from redevelopment. It does not divert property taxes from schools. And we know there are additional RDA 2.0 kinds of proposals that are moving through the legislature, many of which would require or call for the state to actually backfill and keep schools whole, but would require the state to expend funds from the general fund. And so that would have to be agreed upon through legislation at the state level with a new governor. And I know that we'll see some additional movement likely on that issue next year. Assemblymember David Chu had a bill this year to try to do an RDA 2.0, but it was held in the Appropriations Committee. So he'll probably try to negotiate with the governor next year, but we want our tool to be able to benefit from any of those negotiations as well, and then we'll try to make that happen. But I would also say that an RDA 2.0 will likely have lots more strings attached to it, simply because when you have the state government involved, and you'll have audits from the controller and that kind of thing, and you'd have probably limits on the geographies in which the funds could be invested. And those are the kinds of things that happen, obviously, if the state's providing the funding. So our tool only focuses on affordable housing and not other types of infrastructure investments. And it's relatively simple, and it's really it's the local jurisdictions that have the oversight and control over it completely. So this just kind of goes through the process, and I think what we want advocates to do is to work with their city councils and boards of supervisors to bring this idea forward. We are taking, and I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. I think we're also working on, just so you know, a series of amendments this year in the legislature that are kind of technical amendments to AB 1598 based on input from county controllers, who would also be required to set up the system to identify that tax increment and make it available for debt service, potentially if you wanted to issue bonds, which are not required, by the way. You could just kind of do a pay-as-you-go approach and just collect revenues each year from the increment and accumulate those to a certain degree, and then begin to invest in affordable housing and or acquire land, those kinds of activities. Yeah. So we've got a hypothetical example here just to give you an idea of how that might work, and you identify what your tax increment is. And if it were $3 million per year, then you could calculate what size of a bond you could get. And obviously this will vary jurisdiction by jurisdiction based on what the development pattern on the ground is. But you could, depending on a medium-sized city, you could generate significant revenues. In this example, $70 million by issuing bonds, and get that up front. And then over time, just use the increment to pay off the bonds. But in the meantime, then you're addressing the affordable housing crisis by having significant financing available to move forward developments that you may have in your pipeline, and bring them online now when we need them, and not have to wait over time and just collect revenues on a one-off basis and do one project after another. But you could have multiple projects in the ground immediately for those jurisdictions that really want to move on the housing crisis and find solutions based on the reductions of housing, affordable housing dollars that we've had at the state and at the federal levels over time, and the kind of that backlog that's going to kind of help address that immediately. And so this is just a slide that talks about some of the work we're doing this year based on input. We have had jurisdictions that are looking at this tool, and they provide us with input, as I said, the county controller, but also some cities and counties, and they've asked us to do some clarifying technical cleanup to AB 1598. And that's our AB 2035, which you see there, that Assembly Speaker Pro Tem Kevin Mullins carrying that bill for us. And then also another bill which builds on the work that we did last year is AB 1792 by Assemblyman Frazier, which would allow for affordable housing related infrastructure to also be financed through this tool. And not just that, which might be immediately adjacent to the development, but within a half mile even, whether that's water mains, sewer upgrades and extensions that are needed to make sure that you can deliver the affordable housing. It would also make that an eligible activity. In 1598, we had focused first on just the affordable housing, and then wanted to do this as a next step. And Assemblyman Frazier wanted to bring this forward this year, which we think is fantastic and completely complementary to the work we did with AB 1598 last year and are doing this year with AB 2035. So those bills are now on the Senate side and will be heard later this month. And we're cautiously optimistic we'll be able to get these to the governor's desk this year and signed, and then be able to implement these affordable housing authorities in the next year with jurisdictions who are interested in moving forward. So, time for questions.
Great, thank you. We have a few that have come in, and just a reminder to everybody to type your questions into the chat box if you have some for Michael or Pedro. So one question that's come up is just simply, how do you formally create an affordable housing authority? I assume it would require a city council approval and resolution. Is that true?
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay, great. And then can you talk a little bit about how these tax assessments may stack with commercial linkage fees?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how tax assessments may stack with commercial linkage fees?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. The linkage fee is a fee that would be paid by the development, right? Whereas the assessed value increase is an increase that takes place as a result of that through the property taxes that are paid, but is not a new fee. on development.
So you're taxing two different things. One thing is you're taxing the actual building going up and that office space, and you're charging a per square foot fee, but that's a one-time fee. Whereas this actually taxes the increase in property value. And
let me say it a little bit different way. It's not a new tax. It's the existing property tax amount that would be paid. You're just dedicating a portion of that new property tax coming in. It's still the same amount. So you're not increasing taxes. You're just saying we're going to take a portion of that new assessed value, that new property tax, and dedicate it to affordable housing. Whereas the fee is a new fee, a new charge that would have to be borne by the development.
when you build it.
So it sounds like, I know we at Rise Together are trying to figure out how to demystify the affordable housing movement for advocates, because the complexity of it often leaves people out of the process. And so a question on sort of, if you could just say at a simplified level for advocates that really want to enter this space and work towards these towards something like this with their local jurisdiction, what would a few steps be that they could take if they don't, assuming they don't need to know the full complexity of all the ins and outs of this tool?
Absolutely,
what role can advocates play? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, I think that's right. And believe it or not, this is one of the simpler setups for tax increment finance. Right. And it was a whole cottage industry under redevelopment, because you had consultants and bond counsel and all kinds of attorneys and then dedicated staff at the city level who would have to operate these programs, et cetera, and dive into real estate finance and acquisition of real property and all the rest of it. So I think the high level question though is we need to just let people know that there's a tool out here for tax increment finance that's available, and to help work on cooperation, because this really works best when the city and the county would cooperate and find projects of mutual interest and benefit that they're willing to invest in. And the idea, I think, from the county's perspective is obviously, as you all well know, just the cost of homelessness, or those who are in precarious living conditions and in danger of homelessness, and just the pressure on health and human services, the pressure on calls for service in terms of law enforcement, quality of life issues, when you have homelessness encampments, just the challenges those can provide to jurisdictions, and the impact on the county's budgets is a real issue. That was one of the drivers in some of these county bonds, even, was that if we invest in the housing and have a housing first type of a policy and program approach, that it really is the fiscally prudent way for counties to approach it. So the extent that they'd be willing to allow at least a little bit of their portion of the property tax and or sales tax to be invested, it could be in incorporated cities or in the unincorporated areas where you do have a built environment, that's actually beneficial to everyone involved. And so I think to advocates to be able to kind of help bring these parties together, what oftentimes there can be tensions between city and county governments, not always, but in some cases, or there's just a reticence to kind of to engage in revenue sharing of any kind for anything, right? And so to get those conversations started, then they can direct their staff to do the legwork on this and kind of dive into the details on what it might take. But we didn't, we wanted to have a tool that was fairly easy to stand up and to get going at the professional staff level, with a minimum number of consultants needed. Although if you do decide to issue bonds, inevitably you will get bond counsel involved. But cities have municipal bond issuances all the time, and they're used to doing that kind of thing. And so the idea is we just want to make this get the word out about this tool, particularly in local decision makers and electeds' hands, so that they can ask their staff to pursue this, at least to have a study session on it and see what this might mean for them, and to kind of do their own math, because obviously the underlying development in the community will kind of determine to what extent this would be a viable tool for them to use.
And to just to put a finer point to it, so many of the folks on this webinar, while you may not work in the housing space per se, you do have relationships oftentimes with your local elected officials. And so one way that you can immediately enter the space without being an expert is to say, hey, have you heard about affordable housing authorities? It's this new tool that's available that allows you to raise money for affordable housing without raising new taxes. You can leave it at that. You can point them to this webinar. There are other resources out there, and then you can just make sure that you can follow up to make sure that it's actually happening. Continue to ask about it, but you don't need to be the expert in how all of this works to get this going in your community.
And I would also just add, the League of California Cities was very supportive of this effort that we made, and they continue to be so. And they really do think this is probably the best tool since the elimination of redevelopment in 2011. And to have that kind of stamp of approval from the league, I think, is important. It could be potentially persuasive of the elected to at least do some additional due diligence and study on the potential of setting this up. And as Pedro said, I think we want to hit really hard the fact that it doesn't require an increase in taxes, and it just actually dedicates a way to dedicate some revenues that are already coming in as a result of development, and growth, economic growth and development, and that there's no voter approval requirement, and that they have the oversight and control of this tool, and the state can't take it away or really come in and tell them what to do, but they really get to set their priorities at the local level, which is typically something that they're really, it's really important to them.
Okay, great. There's another question about, and it ties into what you're saying about budgets. So wouldn't cities be concerned about impact to their bottom line budgets? Many cities in the Bay Area are looking at structural deficits over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes, and that's the challenge with this tool, but that would be the challenge with just about everything, I think. Even an RDA 2.0 would require some local contribution. So I don't say it's not a challenge, and it depends on just how you size what you want to do, so that you're still leaving resources available, as I said, to meet the pension obligations and in salary negotiations, compensation negotiations with public employee unions and that kind of thing will all figure into this, and that's why it really has to be tailored to the local situation, on the one hand, and that's why oftentimes new revenues are important. But because there are the potential savings, and you're able to address conditions like homelessness in the community, and because you're able to then leverage a relatively small amount of funding at the front end with state programs, which are going to hopefully come online here if we get the bond passed in November, and federal tax credits, still take advantage of those, that we can get some housing developments that will be seen as a benefit to the city, a benefit to neighborhoods, with that, to bring in that kind of investment, because typically we can leverage these funds from anywhere from 3 to 6 times using state and federal resources, but we just need that kind of that first money in at the local level. So each jurisdiction will have their own fiscal concerns, but we look at this over time as a tool that could be helpful if they are able to address their pension obligations. And jurisdictions that do have a lot, I mean, as I said, we see billions of dollars in increase in assessed values, particularly as sales turnover, and because, quite frankly, as a result of the high housing costs in this area, as you know, when property changes hands and the title changes hands, properties are reassessed at that new value. And so over time, in the short term, there may be jurisdictions that are having fiscal difficulties, but over time, we see this as a tool that can be very useful. And over time, the reason these bonds work is because historically assessed values, property taxes in particular, have increased over time, given just the nature of Prop 13 and how that works. And so that's why investors are willing to buy these bonds.
Great, thank you so much. So any last, let's see, there's one more question here. One more question, and then we will turn to sort of next steps and action steps. And so one last question: how might commercial prop 13 reform, which would lead to property tax increases on commercial lands, impact this financing?
So it's a good question, and because some people would say, well, we're simply rewarding those who are just going after, the big boxes and anyway, and so it exacerbates that whole fiscalization of land use problem that we've all identified over time. But what I would say is, to the extent that you do get that Prop 13 reform, and the measure that I've seen really delivers that funding to schools and to local jurisdictions is the idea. To the extent that that helps jurisdictions to be more fiscally sound because they've got more revenues coming in, then it actually makes this even more attractive as a tool, because when you do, for example, if you do have a new commercial development that's encouraged, you can capture a portion of that for housing. Now, that still means we need the good zoning and we need the streamlining for affordable housing and other tools, but to the extent they don't have to worry about this whole issue of siphoning off some of those sales and or property taxes because they're in a good fiscal shape because of this new influx of dollars from commercial properties and those property taxes, it will put us in even a better position to be able to adopt tools like this and to be able to make that case at the local level that housing is not a fiscal loser, that it doesn't matter if it really pays its own way because you're getting an influx of funding from the commercial side, and we actually dispute whether it pays its own way or not because it has all kinds of societal benefits, obviously, that in some cases can be monetized or identified at least in terms of the fiscal benefits. So I think it's just all upside, if that makes sense.
Yep, great. Great, so as we come to a close, any last thoughts on action steps that folks should take around both of these tools from either of you?
Yeah, we'd be glad to help in terms of providing technical assistance and talking points, and even if appropriate, if you do have elected officials who would like to do a study session on this at a city council and or board of supervisors, at least to be able to take a look at it. Maybe the first step would be that we could provide you with the legislation, because typically what a council member will want to do is to give it to their city attorney or staff. Hey, could you take a look at this and just let me know if you think there's potential, or the city manager may want to have a say in this, obviously, because they may have ideas about where they are going fiscally over the next 3 to 5 years, et cetera, and what those hurdles might potentially be, and what the benefits of this might potentially be. But we'd be glad to provide that level of support, and Pedro might also have some ideas about how to go about implementation and advocacy.
So NPH in the past and currently we do provide a lot of technical assistance on, and so I highlighted earlier the inclusionary housing advocacy toolkit that we put together a few years back that's still very applicable today. And if there is enough interest on these tools, we could have a special convening that's targeted to maybe city council members or maybe folks who are interested in enacting these that could have more resources available for you. I think that as an immediate next step, it's worth finding out whether your jurisdiction has an inclusionary zoning ordinance in place, and whether or not your jurisdiction is considering an affordable housing authority. That's step one, and really highlighting that these two new tools are able to provide real benefits and real resources for affordable housing without raising new taxes, which is key, because everything else, sales taxes, general obligation bonds, additional property taxes, you name it, are new taxes that impact everyone, whereas this is something that's far more targeted and uses existing resources that cities and counties have at their disposal. And so ask the questions and get in touch with us or get in touch with your local affordable housing advocacy organization, and I'm happy to provide you all with a list of different groups that operate in different parts of the Bay Area, and try to get some traction on these.
Awesome. Thank you both so very much. It's a wealth of information, and a reminder to everybody that we'll be providing a recording of this webinar and all of the links in PowerPoint on our website. So we will be able to send you a direct link next week if you participated in the webinar of that information. And we want to thank again, NPH, Pedro, and Michael, for participating and for your partnership in this work. And as we try to both provide enough information that people can really take the details of what they need if they're in the housing movement already, and then provide advocates with what they need to start the conversation in their communities and start to demystify this process. So we really appreciate your contribution to doing that. And a shout out to Ensuring Opportunity in Contra Costa County. Woohoo! They are hosting a webinar watching party, which I think is an awesome idea at Richmond Community Foundation. So thanks very much to all of you and to everyone who participated today. And I just wanted to mention the 2 upcoming webinars that we have with NPH. So on August 29th, we will be hosting another webinar in our series on the Affordable Housing Now Veterans and Affordable Housing Act that we will all have the opportunity to vote for in November. It'll provide $4 billion to build homes for our veterans, struggling families, and people experiencing homelessness and people with disabilities. So we'll have the Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement at NPH with us to help us understand how we can all play a role in supporting that initiative. And then on October 22nd, we will have our last webinar in the series on AB 1521, Strengthening the State's Housing Preservation Law. So we will have Danielle Mazzella from the California Housing Partnership Corporation and MPH on that webinar to help us better understand that opportunity as well. So thank you again, Pedro and Michael and everyone at MPH, and then everyone who's participated today. It's been, I think, an incredible learning opportunity for all of us to better understand how we can move toward everyone having access to housing as a right and as a space of dignity for everyone. So truly appreciate your contributions.
Thank you so much, Megan. We really enjoyed being here.
Thank you all.
Great. Thank you all. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.